Good morning, everyone. Looks like we are having some interesting internet issues this morning. Internet keeps jumping in and out. So I apologize in advance if the stream goes back and forth. It's kind of wonky, so I apologize for that in advance if that's the case. So welcome and thank you for joining us here at the Blue Lotus Meditation Mindfulness Center here in Brainerd, Minnesota. Today is January 5th. It is now 6:30 a.m. morning, right? A.m. Thank you for coming and sitting with us this morning. It's a wonderful way to help start your week with mindfulness and with the Buddha's wisdom. So I do want to say thank you and again for that. Happy New Year. Often so ethics, part of our learning is a wonderful consideration. Efforts in our Dharma talks and our ability to help share the Dharma throughout the world and letting you all know that those funds are wisely used. And one of the opportunities that we provide are that mindfulness and meditation, the Dharma camp for teens, for teenagers, and it's usually in the summertime, sometime in July. And it's a free service, right? So the teens get to experience the Dharma, the Buddha's wisdom, mindfulness, and meditation. And so that's just one of the opportunities that your support helps provide. Also, and you also get discounts off our Dharma Institute, off of courses. So thank you again. Another just a brief announcement, our new Facebook Live sessions every week, Wednesdays at 7 a.m. We'll do some guided meditations, a short little talk, perhaps. Mostly it's going to be open for question and answers. And so if you have an opportunity to sit with us for just, maybe 20 minutes or so, 30 minutes at the most, I would expect, but could go on for a long time if needed. So please consider Wednesday mornings at 7 a.m. Central Time in the U.S. Okay. I take refuge in the Buddha. I take refuge in the Dharma. I take refuge in the Sangha. Satu. So today's topic, freedom through ethical living. Right? Again, it's an important aspect of mindfulness. Because mindfulness and meditation, those are steps on the path, but we also have to live ethically, right? Not harming one another, not harming ourselves, and being mindful in our speech and actions. So today we'll turn our attention to that theme, right? That sits at the very heart of the Buddhist path, right? Ethics, and that's the training in sīla, right? And so while mindfulness and meditation and wisdom often receive the most attention, right? We often hear about mindfulness and meditation and so forth. But the Buddha repeatedly taught that ethical conduct, it's not a secondary practice, but it's the very foundation of liberation. And without stabilizing our actions and speech, the mind cannot settle. And without cultivating harmlessness and compassion and honesty, wisdom cannot unfold. So it's important to consider that, right? We're not going to be, we can't have the wisdom that we need to make ethical decisions if we don't cultivate harmlessness, right? We don't want to harm anyone else or ourselves, other sentient beings, and compassion and honesty. Honesty is important, right? Honesty helps build trust between people and groups of people. And in the Dhammapada, the Buddha states that not falling into error is the greatest virtue, and the disciplined mind is the greatest wealth. Right? So the disciplined mind is the greatest wealth. We often put a high priority or high idealism or ideal aspect towards, people who may be very affluent, right? But thinking that, oh, we're poor, we don't have a lot of money, and that could make us feel sad. But the Buddha tells us very clearly and without error that the disciplined mind is the greatest wealth. And that's something that we can all work on, right? Something that we can all strive to achieve. And ethics is not about commandments. The Buddha never stated, do this because I said so. He never said that, right? Instead, he invited us to look deeply at our actions and see for ourselves, which leads to suffering and which leads to freedom. And that's important, right? That's an important distinction that he tells us, don't do it because I'm telling you to, right? Try it, see what works for you, right? What is going to lead to suffering in you individually, and what actions lead to freedom. And that's where the wisdom comes in, or results, I should say. Because then we learn what right actions are and what right mindfulness is, right contemplation, right livelihood. So it's an important aspect of Buddhism. It doesn't tell you what to do, right? Buddha doesn't say, again, I'm telling you to do this. It's not what it's about. So in the early teachings, sīla is described as the first training, the basis upon which samadhi, right, concentration, or wisdom, pana, right, naturally grow. And the Buddha also tells us that regarding virtue, when one is virtuous, right, not given to misconduct in body, in speech, in mind, one dwells with ease and without remorse. So when we have good behavior, good ethics, right, we're not given to, mistreating our bodies. And there's a lot of ways that we can mistreat our bodies, right? Or speech, how we speak to one another, or even to ourselves, right speech. Or our mind, right? Right contemplation, right mindfulness. Right? We can dwell with freedom, with that ease, and without remorse, right? Without thinking, wow, I shouldn't have done this, right? I shouldn't have done that. And remorse is turbulence in the heart. And ethical conduct calms this turbulence, right? And so when our words are harsh or deceitful or rooted in greed, we plant seeds that keep the mind restless. But when we cultivate wholesome conduct, the mind, the mind becomes spacious, light, and ready for deep seeing, because we have that space within our mind. And we can see deeply in our actions why we did this. And we can reflect on it more wholesomely. And the Buddha also described ethics as protection. It's like armor, right? It's protection. And when we practice generously, when we practice generosity, honesty, and harmlessness and restraint of the senses, we protect our hearts from falling into patterns that cause pain, right? It's not sequestering ourselves away from everybody, right? It's not that kind of armor. That's not too healthy when we just keep ourselves away and avoid people. And so ethics is not a punishment, but it's a guardrail to freedom, right? It's discipline. Because when we find out when we have ethics or guardrails to follow, we're not just at the whim of base emotions that can be hurtful or harmful to others. And so the Buddha also taught that just as a bird needs two wings to fly, so does the practitioner need both virtue and wisdom, right? And without virtue, wisdom is unstable. And without wisdom, virtue is blind. And together they support the realization of nibbana. Excuse me. So the five ethical teachings that the Buddha presented to ourselves, and that most lay practitioners know and practice, practitioners, right, are the five precepts, right? Not rules, but trainings, right? They're not moral judgments, but mindfulness commitments, right? And the Buddha called them the gifts. Remember the guardrails for ethics? And we hold them, we give safety to others, and we receive safety in return, right? And the Buddha begins with non-harming, right? Because all ethics begins with compassion, right? First precept, to abstain from killing, right? And then from the Dhammapada, again, the Buddha tells us, and why, right? Because all tremble at violence and all fear death. And seeing others as yourself, we don't want to kill or cause to kill. And that's important. So when we see physical violence all out in the world, they're certainly not, whoever those, are doing those actions are not falling in line with very first precept, right? So to not harm, includes, more than refraining though from physical violence. It includes how we speak to others, how we treat ourselves, in the way that we consume, right? And the intentions behind our choices. Non-harming invites the heart to soften. And it asks us to expand our circle of care to all beings, seen and unseen. So that means seen and unseen means the ones that we have in contact with, right? Maybe coworkers, family, friends, but also people across the world, right? If you ever look at statistics and they say, 32 people were, killed in action or something like that. They're not just numbers. They're people. They had families. Somebody loved them and they loved somebody else. So compassion towards everyone. And then the second precept, right? Training in not taking what is not giving. So abstaining from stealing, right? So this is the training in honesty, in generosity, and respect. And taking what is not freely given includes stealing time, right? Or attention, or credit, or emotional labor, right? Emotional feelings. We can manipulate people into feeling some kind of way, shaming someone, for example. And the Buddha emphasizes that integrity of action is essential for a mind that seeks freedom. And again, the Buddha tells us in the Dhammapada, the one who, through honesty, leads a life of virtue, illuminates the world like the moon, freed from the clouds. And that's interesting, right? Because we can even see the light from behind the clouds of the moon, but it's not until the cloud disappears that full intensity is out there. And then the third training, right? Wise relationships and sexual responsibility, right? Abstaining from sexual misconduct. And this training is not about prudishness, right? So it's important to understand it's not about prudishness, but about harm, reproduction, or reduction. Sexual misconduct is defined in the early teachings as behavior that causes suffering through betrayal, exploitation, or coercion. And it protects trust, which is one of the greatest pillars of that wholesome community. So cheating, right? Manipulating, certainly all the violent sexual acts that we see on television and so forth, but even the small ones, right? That passive aggressiveness. You don't love me because, right? If you do this, you love me. If you don't, you don't love me. Things like that, right? Exploitation, right? And manipulation. And so that is a violation of the that third ethic, right? And then again, the Buddha tells us one should not engage in sensual conduct that brings harm to oneself or others. So think about that. Think about our actions, maybe in the past. I know I am. Way long ago, long time ago, that probably weren't the best actions, right? When we were younger, impulsive, because we didn't have these trainings. We didn't follow through on them. And so this is a training in respect and honesty and compassion. And when undertaken wisely, relationships become fields of kindness rather than arenas of craving. Right? Relationships are built on trust and compassion, right? Not usury. It's not a relationship. Coercion, that's not a relationship. And then the fourth one is training in truthful speech. So right speech, not lying, right? And our words create worlds. Okay. Our words, they create worlds for people, including ourselves. And the Buddha placed tremendous emphasis on speech, more than almost any other category of action. And then again, in the Dhammapada, the Buddha tells us, better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace. Right? So a lot of times people can talk peace, but do they act on it? And then he also tells us, speak only the word that is true and which leads to harmony. Again, avoiding divisiveness, right? Being a unifier instead of a divider. And so truthful speech means more than avoiding lies, right? It means refraining from that divisive speech, from harsh speech and idle chatter that feeds ego and conflict, water cooler talk, right? If you're familiar or not familiar with that term, water cooler talk simply means that, during break time, people would gather around the water cooler, right? Where they get water and drink, and they would just gossip, or a coffee break. I get that coffee break talk, right? And so the Buddha tells us that, that right speech is rooted in a heart of goodwill. And think about a lot of those pessimistic talk, those sayings, right? Pessimistic television shows that just kind of bring us down. So the fifth precept, right, the fifth training is in sobriety and mindfulness of consumption, right? And this training projects or protects the clarity of our awareness. It's not primarily about substances like alcohol or drugs, but it is about avoiding any intake that clouds mindfulness or leads to heedlessness, right? And the Buddha tells us that heedlessness in the path is the path to death, right? And the heedful, they never die. Right? So this includes intoxicants, right? But also media. What type of movies, what type of social media do you enjoy? Right? In fact, I just had a blog post about video consumption, right? Especially doing our best to avoid certain violent television shows and media and whatnot. Trying to not elicit those base emotions of violence and within ourselves. But it also includes conversations, right? And mental habits that intoxicate the heart. So this training is about staying awake. And so we can't be mindful if we're not aware, right? If we're out of reality. So certainly with intoxicants, how are we to experience life? How are we to develop wisdom and nurture compassion and empathy if you're drunk? Right? That takes us away from that. And we don't learn the tools, the skills to help us navigate difficult emotions if you're not there. And then the Noble Eightfold Path and ethical conduct, right? Again, the Buddha emphasizes, those embedded ethics directly into the Noble Eightfold Path, right? And those three limbs, if you look at there are three limbs in the Eightfold Path, right? Right speech, right action, right livelihood, right? And this shows how central ethics is not an optional side practice, but integral to liberation. Right? How we speak, how we earn a living, and our actions. Right? Very important. And right speech, meaning speaking truthfully, kindly, in ways that are conducive to harmony. And the Buddha encouraged us to ask those four questions. You may have heard these before, right? Those gates, right? Is it true? Right? Before speaking, right? Ask ourselves, is it true? Is it beneficial? Is it spoken at the right time? And is it spoken with a good heart or goodwill? And that's important. So we often hear, actually our next talk is going to be on authenticity of ourselves, but I'm just authentically me. We're unapologetic. I'm unapologetically me. And we have to be mindful about that. Because sometimes, is that being authentically you? Is that speaking with a heart of goodwill? Right. May or may not be true. may or may not be beneficial, right? So timing is also important. Okay. Timing is also important when we say truthful, right? Truthful statements. And so the Buddha also tells us in the case that the words of the Tathagata knows to be true, correct, and beneficial, he knows the right time to utter them. So just because something is true and correct and advantageous or beneficial or helpful, timing is important. Perhaps if you've ever had a conversation with your boss or your spouse, right? You may not have been berated or chastised in front of everybody. That wouldn't be good behavior. That would not be right action. But maybe they pull you aside later on and have that conversation with you, and everything is truthful and beneficial and so forth, and correct. And then the right time is privately. So that's important. And right action, which includes the first three precepts, right? Not harming, not stealing, and sexual misconduct, right? Not having sexual misconduct. Right action is the art of making the world safer through our choices, right? It is practicing generosity when greed arises, patience when anger arises, and compassion when fear arises. It is seeing ourselves in others. People often lash out when they're fearful because they are fearful of losing something that is impermanent, and just to begin with, right? People lash out when they're angry and don't display patience. Sometimes you see that with parents, young parents, even with small children, they lose their patience. So it's important that we practice right action, right? And when we feel ourselves being greedy or stingy, we can turn that around and recognize that greed within ourselves and turn it around into generosity. And then with right livelihood, right, the Buddha taught that the way that we earn our living affects the heart. Livelihood should align with harmlessness, respect, and compassion. And then he insists livelihoods to avoid, right, such as dealing in weapons, intoxicants, or living beings, human trafficking, for example, because they intrinsically generate suffering. Right? And right livelihood also asks, does my work nourish or erode my capability for compassion? If it harms others, the heart cannot be free. Right? So think about that. If you're in an occupation where you have a potential to hurt somebody else, your heart, right, won't be free. And that could weigh heavily on you, right? Thinking about how you are impacting somebody else's life. So ethics as a path to freedom, but not morality. Right? That's an important distinction. The Buddha did not teach ethics as a should, but as an experiment. He spoke in the spirit of the Kalama Sutta, that when you know for yourselves that certain actions are unwholesome, then abandon them. And then when you know for yourself that certain actions are wholesome, then enter and abide in them. If you know something is wrong, you don't do it. How can you tell if something is wrong? It's a good question that we get sometimes. How do you know if your behavior is wrong? And one of the practices that I use is, am I questioning myself? If I have to ask myself, is this a good behavior or wrong behavior? Or predominantly, is this an unwholesome action? then I know it is. Right? I'll take a moment to reflect on it because I may not always see the different repercussions. Nobody can see the future, but I look at my intentions and so forth. But asking yourselves, right? And if you have to dwell on it too long, it's probably unwise to choose that action. And so ethics becomes liberating when we take them up with a spirit of inquiry, right? So asking ourselves, like I said, right? We have to ask ourselves, and how does the heart feel when I act with integrity? How does it feel when you act with integrity? Questions to ask yourself. How does the mind feel when I speak harshly or dishonestly? Have you ever yelled at somebody and then a few moments later, like, wow, I shouldn't have said that? A lot of times you see that, right? Somebody, I'm so sorry for what I said. I shouldn't have said that. Okay. What arises when I give safety to others? It's important. What arises within you when you know that you're helping someone become safe, right? Feeling refuge within you or with you. How does that, what arises within you? And then what arises when I take what is not given? Stealing. Do you feel badly about yourself? That's an unwholesome action, right? And so through mindfulness, we discover that ethics, purity of the mind, right? And as the Buddha again taught his own son, Rahul, Buddha had children, right? That whenever you act, or speak, or think, reflect. Will this lead to harm? If it will, abandon it. If it will not, go ahead and proceed. Then ethics becomes a living meditation. It is developing a heart that naturally chooses compassion because it knows deeply that compassion leads to freedom. And loving kindness, right, as a root to ethics, right? Ethical conduct is not limited to restraint, right? It is also, remember the guardrails? It is also the active cultivation of loving kindness and compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. So thinking about those rails, right? The results, right? When we live within those guardrails for ethics, right? What are the results? Loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, equanimity. And then in the Metta Sutta, again, the Buddha gives the instruction that one cultivate in a boundless heart towards all beings. Let none deceive another or despise any being whatsoever. Let none, through anger or ill will, wish harm upon another. How many times do we hear that? He got what's coming to them. Or, serves them right. Right? We don't wish harm or ill will towards anyone. That says a lot about us when we do that. Right? It's a step that we can take, right, to abandon, because that's an unwholesome action, right? Wanting to, ill will to happen towards somebody else. And then a mind established in loving kindness naturally resists harming. A heart steepened in compassion naturally avoids deception. And ethics are not separate from love. In fact, they are the fragments, or the fragrance, I should say. They are the fragrance of a loving heart. And again, in the Dhammapada, the Buddha teaches that hatred is never appeased, right, by hatred. It's by love alone that hatred is appeased. And that is the eternal law. Violence always begets more violence. So all those little wars that we see from nations, they don't stop more wars. The anger between two people, maybe leading to an actual physical altercation, doesn't stop. Because somebody else is going to feel defeated and want to come back. And then that cycle just continues. And so the Buddha's ethics, just in a single verse: do no harm, cultivate love, meet the world with goodwill, and walk gently. And then what are the results? What are the fruits of our ethical living? Right? Immediately, peace of mind. Right? The Buddha again tells us that when a practitioner upholds the ethical trainings, they experience blameless happiness. Right? They experience blameless happiness. Their heart becomes light. There is no guilt, no need to hide, no inner restlessness. And this peace is a gift to oneself. Right? It's a natural byproduct. It's immediate. Social fruits, right? Harmony and community. Ethics create communities built on trust. One of the things that I'm always happy to see is whenever we go to the various pagodas to visit, whether here or in Cambodia, just the community. Everybody's working together. People go to the pagoda almost every day to help and to meet and to commune with one another. And so when we speak with kindness and act with integrity and meet others with non-harm, we create conditions for a sangha, that spiritual friendship, to flourish. So it's important to have that community with one another. Social bonds are important for people. Man is not an island of their own. And meditative fruit, deep concentration, a mind that is not entangled in regret or conflict, settles naturally, right, into samadhi. And this is why the Buddha placed ethics before meditation. Ethics is meditation extended into daily life. And then the ultimate fruit is liberation. Ethical conduct supports wisdom. Wisdom supports liberation. And again, in the Dhammapada, I quote a lot from the Dhammapada because it's an important text for us to learn and study. And from virtue arises peace. And from peace arises joy. And from joy arises insight. And with insight, the mind is free. Again, no regrets. We alleviate suffering. We have cats jumping on our here during our talk. Gus, our Dharma cat. And it's important to understand that the Buddha did not invent ethics. Right? Yeah, he just simply revealed how ethics purify the conditions that obscure awakening. And I'm reminded again, just offhand right now, that the Buddhas show us the way. Right? The Buddhists show us the way. It is up to us to walk that path. Right? We have to do the work. Nobody can wave their hand and automatically grant us wisdom. Nobody can wave their hand and magically grant us compassion or empathy. These are skills and qualities that we need to nurture with our own practice. And so today, let's just simply remember that ethics in the Buddhist teachings are not commandments, and they're not judgments, and they're not moralistic demands. They are invitations to freedom. And the Buddha offered those 5 trainings in the Noble Eightfold Path as a skillful means to soften the heart and to clarify the mind and to cultivate compassion for all beings. When we refrain from harming, generosity grows. When we refrain from taking what is not given, trust grows. When we refrain from unskillful sensual conduct, respect grows for ourselves and for others. When we speak truthfully, harmony grows. When we refrain from intoxicants, clarity grows. And every ethical step we take is a step towards liberation, and every act of kindness is a seed of awakening. And every moment of integrity is a moment of peace, because we don't have to be remorseful. And then the Buddha closes many of his teachings with a simple image, right? That lamp illuminating a dark room. And ethics is that lamp. And when we live ethically, we illuminate our own path and help illuminate the path of others. And may we walk the path of harmlessness. May our speech be gentle and true. May our actions bring safety to all beings. And may our hearts grow spaciously, fearlessly, and free. And then may the merit of our reflection today be shared with all beings. And so as you go about today, think about what we talked about. Try to practice what we talked about. Maybe there's an aspect in your practice that you wanted to try, right? Maybe something in today's talk elicited some type of visual practice or behavior that you want to nurture and grow, or even refrain from. And so, anyway, thank you for coming out. I know we went over a little bit this morning. And so I do want to thank you again for coming and spending some of your morning with us. It's important to begin our week with mindfulness and points of reflection. So with that, we are greatly appreciative of you spending some of your time with us here at the Blue Lotus Meditation and Mindfulness Center. And our next talk will be on Monday, January 19th, and we'll discover our true authentic selves using the Dharma and the Buddhist teachings. So I kind of alluded to that a little bit earlier in one of our moments together. So with that, my friends, I wish you all a day of well-being, peace, and ease. And we'll see you in 2 weeks, or Wednesday if you decide to join us on our Facebook channel. Many blessings to you.